Hi everybody, this is Tony Contaspati from the Great Vocal Majority. In December of 1991, the first nation based on the principles of Karl Marx dissolved. For 74 years, the Soviet Union governed itself based on the philosophical interpretations of Karl Marx of the nature of man and society, and also through Lenin's application of that philosophy into a construct for government. But the Soviet Union failed, as did all the other governments within its sphere of influence. And while the Marxist state of Red China survived, it was not without a massive reformation. Even with the reformation, however, China remains in a constant state of struggle and is thought to be very unstable. Other Marxist states, like Cuba and North Korea, are prisoner countries where the whole population is forbidden to travel. The question is that needs to be asked is, why did Marxism and communism fail in Russia, and why is it struggling everywhere else? The simple answer is this. In order to be successful, any political philosophy must correctly interpret man's basic nature, or at least come close. Political philosophies which are based on ideas that are either false or misinterpret the nature of man and his place in the world cannot succeed. This short video presentation will explain the three foundational laws of Marxism and their fatal errors that have had such a tragic consequence for so much of humanity. So I have entitled this video, Why Marx and Communism Fails. Here's the question. How does communist philosophy view nature and knowledge? And the reason why that's an important question is because every political philosophy has a view of nature and knowledge, and the success of that philosophy really is determined by these very foundational principles upon which any political philosophy is based. Communists believe in something called materialism. Now, that's not like materialism that you think of, like, somebody who's materialistic and they just like things and they like to collect things. Materialism deals with something much more deeper and profound. It's about matter, about just matter itself. And the way communists look at things, they believe that all knowledge has its basis in matter, because they believe that science, if it can know everything there is to know about matter, it will know everything there is to know about everything. Because for the communists and for the Marxists, they don't believe there's anything beyond matter. All that exists is all that is in matter. In other words, there's no spirituality in Marxism at all. So there are three questions that communists claim to answer. The first question is, what is the origin on energy and motion in nature? The second question is, what causes the elements of nature to increase in numbers? Why do populations grow? Why do galaxies and planets seem to be created more and more? All kinds of things. Everything in nature seems to increase in number. And what are the origins of life and species and even human consciousness? To understand this, Marx created three laws of matter. The first law is called the law of opposites. The second law, the law of negation. And the third law, the law of transformation. But what are these laws? What do they purport to say about nature and about man and about our place in the universe and everything else? Well, let's look at the law of opposites first. Marx and Engels believed that everything in existence was a combination or a unity of opposites that created a conflict that was kind of self-regenerating. In other words, you had like a proton and an electron. They were opposites, and they created a motion. And even within an individual, their personalities, you have your good side and your bad side. And, they just looked at everything in those terms. And there's some validity to that. So people look at that and they say, that kind of resonates. I can see what Marx is talking about, that everything has contained within it its opposite. And the good way to look at that is through the atom. So they believe that this unity of opposites in all things gave rise to movement. So that's a very critical thing to understand. They believe it was the things that were contained within a person or within even an atom, let's say, that were opposite is what gave rise to the movement of the proton and the electron. That's very important to understand. In addition to that, they also believed matter did not need some outside source of power for its manifestation of motion. And what really Marx was getting at here, he really was at war with the notion of God. So he was always looking to try to negate or dismiss the fact of a God. So he wanted to concoct this philosophy and an idea that said, well, you don't really need a God. And this is what he did. This was the first law, the law of opposites, that stated that matter kind of creates its own movement, and the energy for it comes within those things, and it doesn't come from outside there. In other words, it doesn't come from a creator. And here's the example of the atom. As you could see, the protons in yellow and the electrons circling around it. Then there's the law of negation, which is just a fancy way of saying the law of dying. Everything dies. But it doesn't just die, and that's the important thing to understand with the way Marx viewed things. Marx and Engels believed that nature tended to multiply itself in the quantity in all things. And this is what I've said earlier. They believed that the increases occurred without any guiding intelligence. Planets were formed and galaxies were created and solar systems, and that just happened because things were bumping into each other. It didn't have anything to do with any kind of higher intelligence, according to Marx. And that all things in nature constantly expand through dying and regeneration. This is important. I mean, Marx believed that, the human being, for example, would regenerate by reproducing, then they would die, and then those people would regenerate, and they would die, and, things that in that constant struggle between opposites and motion. So you see how this is beginning to come together into the Marxist view of nature. Then the third law that Marx had is the law of transformation. Now, Marx and Engels believed that there was this continuous quantitative increase in a particular class of things, whatever it may be. It could be people, it could be frogs, it could be fish in the ocean. But that constant increase would evolve or spontaneously create something different. It's almost, this is where he tries to link Marxism to Darwin's evolutionary theories. So, but Marx believed that matter alone, by its very nature, because it contains opposites and those things generate motion in his view, that produced new forms of itself without the need for any creative or directing power external to itself. And let me give you an example of what that is. What you see here is an atomic diagram of the element methane. 4 atoms of hydrogen, represented by the H, and 1 atom of carbon, represented by the C. But if you just introduced another carbon atom and two more hydrogen atoms, you would create an entirely new substance with new properties called ethane. And if you did the same thing again, you would create an entirely third different kind of substance called propane. So Marx used this as an example to show that, hey, this is how matter can create by itself. So through these laws, the three laws that you just saw, Marx and Engels thought they had answered the question, what is life? I said, look at this. This is how it happens. It's not God. The notion of God is quaint. It's old hat. You know, matter has its own motion. Matter creates its own. Matter is self-creating. And Marx believed that since human beings are the highest form of nature, then we are really God. So that was the step where Marx went beyond, and he said, you know, human beings are more than what they actually are. But he felt that we were the highest form of development. So the conclusions that the communists draw from these three laws. The first conclusion is everything in nature came about as a result of endless motion among the forces of nature. Second conclusion is that everything is a product of an accumulated accident. There's no design or law. In other words, man is really an accident. He wasn't a creation that was intentional. He was a creation that would have happened because there's motion in matter and everything kind of gets jumbled together, and eventually, because of the dialectic of Marx that says that there's always going to be a synthesis and an antithesis and a resynthesis, and you know that's always going to happen, that eventually there's going to be intelligence and man and a human consciousness. And Marx also confined everything he believed to matter, things that, you know, tangible things. So there is only matter and force in nature. There is no God. So you could see how Marx felt that he really nailed down existence. Existence is what you can see. None of this talk about spirituality, baloney. And forget God. That didn't happen. Everything is caused by matter and nature. It's all there. That's all there is. You know, get over it. That's essentially what Marx was saying. However, I have a quote here from W. Cleon Skousen that says, having denounced God, the scriptures, morals, immorality, external judgment, existence of the spirit, and the sanctity of individual human life, the dialectic materialists turn to the worship of themselves. So this has almost a biblical kind of connotation to it, where it's man declaring himself a god. It's really quite something. But there are fatal fallacies in what I just told you in terms of Marx's view of reality. And we're going to go through them through each law. So let's look at the law of opposites. What's the fallacy in that? Well, first of all, let's just restate that this law is supposed to explain the law of motion. It's explaining how things interact with each other, what causes them to move. And Marx was saying that it's this dialectic of opposites. In other words, the positive and the negative fighting it out and then they create something different. But two contradictory elements would never come together unless they already had energy. See, Marx believed that the energy was derived from their interaction, that a proton didn't have a positive charge if there was no electron nearby. I mean, that's what Marx believed, and that is demonstrably false. In nature, Contradictory forces are observed as having energy independent of each other, as I just said. And their union merely combines their already existing energy and motion. In other words, the communist law of opposites fails to explain motion because it presupposes it. Now let's go to the next fatal fallacy, which is the law of concerning the law of negation. Now this law attempts to account for the numerical increases we see in nature. It says that contradictory forces in an entity tend toward its own negation or death, as I mentioned earlier about people and how they eventually die, but they usually have, they reproduce. But through the process of dying, this law states, these forces of motion tend to an even larger population. So what Marx was saying is that the fact that people die, that law is what leads them to reproduce. And Marx argued, both Marx and Engels argued, that there's this blind and uncomprehending force of mechanical motion that's capable of ordering itself to produce intricate things which are designed in advance to achieve a predetermined end. And that's just a fancy way of saying, how could all this happen exactly the way it does happen if things occur the way Marx says they occur? Because there's no linkage between the two. So, to state it a different way, this law describes a natural phenomena without explaining it. I mean, sure, people live and die, but there's no link between you dying and your reproduction. I mean, you may want to reproduce, you may want to have children, but you're going to die whether you have them or not. So it's not, one doesn't lead to the other. Marx this was a disjointed theory. So, but even Engels himself could not conclude that this could ever be demonstrated in nature. So the law of negation is also fallacious. Then there's the law of transformation. Well, if the law of negation was wrong, and the first law was wrong, then this law can't be right, because this law requires those first two laws to be true. This law supposes to explain the origins of life after having spontaneously rose from the application of the first two laws. So life, according to Marx, arose from the accelerating motion created by the conflict of opposites in an endless cycle of negation and regeneration. But it doesn't happen the way he described it. It just doesn't happen that way. So that is, to put it in real terms for you, life and human consciousness arose out of nature by accident, according to Marx, resulting from the motion and interaction of matter. And it's like a mindless thing. It means, like, Marx is just basically saying, look, all this stuff is in the universe and it's all slapping together and knocking around and it's banging into each other, and eventually it creates some chemical compound that spontaneously generates life. It's, like pond scum or something, and then that eventually will evolve into a human being, and that's how it works. I mean, there's just one problem. All throughout all scientific study and experience, only life has ever come from life. We have never had a way to create synthetic life. That hasn't been done yet. Maybe never. I mean, you can never say never in science. But the point is that it can't be demonstrated the way Marx said it is demonstrable. So it just isn't true. So here's our conclusion. Communism fails because it's grounded on a foundation of erroneous assumptions about the world. You just saw the three main assumptions. I didn't even get into the socialism part or the sharing and the collectivism. Forget that. You don't even need to go that far. Karl Marx based everything on his view of the world that I just described to you. So if he's wrong on that, how could he be right on anything else that leads from that? His initial assumptions were wrong. So in order for any organizing principle or philosophy to succeed, it's got to come within some reasonable proximity of the real world. Now, in his real life, Karl Marx was a misfit. All of his children died because of his neglect. It wasn't that he left his wife, it's that he never held a job. He always was researching and doing things. He was trying to start revolutions. It was a rabble rouser. He was always broke, and he was always in debt. He was always borrowing money. His children were dying of hunger. Many of them died. And all of them died before him, including his wife, who never left him. The man was a total misfit who had an ambition to change the world that led him. He was so driven to create a theory of everything that would destroy the concept of God, and it was and the regular social order that existed at the time. He really, really hated it. But the sad part is that his ideas led to more than 100 million people being killed in the last century in pursuit of that idea. When you look at Pol Pot in Cambodia, who killed like a third of the country, murdered them. Why did he kill them? He killed them. Was it because he was just a mass murderer and because he just wanted people to adhere to his dictatorial line? In part, yes. But that isn't the only reason. He really was a killer because he believed what Marx wrote. And Marx was basically believed at the time during the communist internationals in the mid to late 1800s that there would have to be a bloody revolution to kill all the people who still adhered to the old ways. See, Marx believed that this idea of the Hegelian dialectic of synthesis, antithesis, and that dialectic, that had to play itself out in humanity, that we had to all slaughter each other so that what was left over would be the pure communist man. That's really what he was looking for, the man of materialism. And that's why communism is so dangerous. And that's why communism fails. And the reason why this is relevant today, some people may be listening to this and saying, what the hell does this have to do with anything that's going on now? Well, I would encourage you to look at what the people in movements like the Occupy Wall Street movement and the people who are complaining about the top 1% and the 99%, really look into the foundational principles that they are arguing, because it all leads back right here to this guy, Marx. And it's all wrong. It's all wrong-headed. And that's why free market capitalism and small r Republican government in a democracy really works best for human beings. Now, is it perfect? No, it's not perfect. But it does come closer to true human nature. And that's why it's been successful. Whereas Marx completely misses the mark, and that's why it's been so disastrous. That's why there hasn't really, that no communist country that adhered to Marxist principles ever succeeded, because they can't succeed. It's based on completely flawed notion. And that's it. That's what I had for you today. I hope that this was interesting to you and you get a chance to look at the the book that this is based on. There's a deeper to get a deeper understanding of some of these really unreconcilable issues within Marx's ideas and communism and even socialism. There's a book that was written a long time ago, probably about 50 years ago, by a Cold War writer named W. Cleon Skousen, who wrote this book, The Naked Communist. And I based this presentation on some things in that book. And I think it's a read that people who are interested in politics and people who haven't been political science students in school might be interested in educating themselves about, because you're going to hear themes in there that are going to resonate today. Even though the Soviet Union fell, there's still adherents to this philosophy in some form. And it's no less erroneous just because they've tried to jerry-rig it to something, more applicable to today. That's it for me, Tony Codispoti from Great Vocal Majority. I hope you enjoyed it. Take care, everybody.